Welcome everyone to our two-part webinar series entitled Today's Questions, Tomorrow's Answers, A Journey Towards Understanding Medicinal Cannabis in Children. My name is Dr. Lauren Kelly, and I serve as a Scientific Director and Principal Investigator for the Canadian Childhood Cannabinoid Clinical Trial Research Team. Today, our panelists are joining us from coast to coast. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of the Inuit, Métis, and First Nation people that call this land home. I myself am based here in Winnipeg on Treaty 1 territory and the heartland of the Métis Nation. We're delighted to offer these webinars live, and we'll be sharing recorded versions on our website. Questions can be submitted in several ways throughout the presentation. You can submit them online using a Slido link in the YouTube description, or you can use the hashtag C4T Webinars 2021. You can also use this on Twitter to contact us and ask questions during the presentation. You can also submit questions through the YouTube comments function. All of the questions that were submitted at registration have already been queued for our panelists. Today we are going to hear from a wide variety of stakeholders on pediatric medical cannabis, an overview of research trends, which will be presented by Dr. Taylor Lougheed. Dr. Evan Lewis will talk about how cannabinoids work and pharmacokinetics in children. And every road is different. A parent's experience with medicinal cannabis for their children, which will be presented by our C4T parent partners, Alexander Repetski, Tracy and Mandy McKnight. Before we begin, I think it's really important when you're hearing about cannabis researchers to understand our backgrounds and where we come from. I do hold public funding from the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, the Canadian Cancer Society, MyTax, and the Sick Kids Foundation, related to ongoing C4T projects. Health Products Containing Cannabis Scientific Advisory Board, I am a member there with Health Canada, and I also serve as a Board of Directors member for the Canadian Consortium for the Investigation of Cannabinoids. I have no financial conflicts of interest to declare related to these webinars or to C4T research. Who is C4T? The Canadian Childhood Cannabinoid Clinical Trial Team was founded in 2018. We are an academic and independent group of researchers, healthcare providers, parents, and youth, a variety of whom you will hear from over the next two webinars. And we conduct a variety of research studies. We have more than 101 members with more than 20 active projects. You can learn all about our projects on the C4 Trials website. You can also send us an email if you're interested in attending our monthly meetings or receiving our newsletter. We have a great panel for you today, including Dr. Evan Lewis. Evan Lewis has significant clinical experience with medical cannabis in both adults and children. He is a member of the Canadian Consortium for the Investigation of Cannabinoids, the Cannabinoid Research Initiative of Saskatchewan, and the Canadian Childhood Cannabinoid Clinical Trial Group. He's a qualified investigator and site lead for a clinical trial on cannabis for the treatment of chronic daily headaches that will begin in 2020. Dr. Lewis is the Chief Medical Advisor for the Jamaican Medical Cannabis Corporation. He is an expert member of the Medical Cannabis Clinician Society in the United Kingdom, and he sits on the advisory councils for cannabis patient advocacy and support services and for MedCan. He has spoken extensively on cannabis in neurological disorders nationally and internationally. Dr. Taylor Lougheed is an experienced cannabinoid consultant whose referral-based practice includes a large pediatric population. He has given more than 100 medical cannabinoid talks to various academic and community groups over the years and is delighted to be here today as a part of our panel. He has additionally acted as an expert consultant for a variety of licensed producers who are looking to refine their medical cannabis offerings, and for hospitals and healthcare organizations who are developing medicinal cannabis policies. His primary cannabinoid research interests include dose and strain refinement, with a specific interest in pain conditions, seizure disorders, autism spectrum disorder, and anxiety. Welcome, Taylor. We have three parent partners from C4T who are joining us today. The first is Mandy. Mandy McKnight became an accidental advocate for safe use of medical cannabis when her son Liam reached the end of his medical journey with conventional therapies. Liam suffers from Dravet syndrome, a rare and catastrophic form of epilepsy for which there is no cure and treatment options are currently limited. Over the last 8 years, after witnessing the incredible progress that Liam has made since starting cannabis as a treatment for seizures, Mandy has become a vocal advocate for kids in cannabis, helping other parents navigate the regulations in order to obtain safe access to medical cannabis for their sick children. She spoke out against Health Canada's regulation that required her son to smoke his medication, and she was also granted intervenor status in the R.V. Smith Supreme Court case, where she was able to outline the impact that these restrictive regulations of dry form cannabis had on Liam's life. She sat on the Patient Advisory Board of Industry Producers, as well as the Cannabis Council of Canada, where she brings a voice for parents and caregivers of pediatric patients suffering from devastating illnesses. Mandy is passionate about patients, especially kids, getting fair access to cannabis as treatments for their illnesses. Our second parent presenting with us today is Alexander Repetski. Alexander began investigating cannabis in 2013 for his daughter after failing numerous medications for intractable epilepsy. For the past 9 years, he has been active in the Canadian cannabis industry, both in production, design, and in various research activities. Alexander is passionate about design, automotive engineering, his family well-being, and of course, the scientific advancement of the medical cannabis sector. He also enjoys a good hug. Our final parent partner presenting with us today is Tracy Brace. As a registered psychiatric nurse, Tracy has dedicated her career to supporting and walking with individuals on their healing journey from concurrent mental health and substance use disorders. Her clinical practice is enriched with a deep awareness of cultural safety and trauma-informed care. As a parent, Tracy's journey with the health system began when her son was born preterm. He had a 4-month stay in the neonatal intensive care unit. At 2.5 years old, her son was diagnosed with a brain tumor, and she found herself advocating for medical cannabis for her son. Tracy's interests naturally align with family-centered care, and she found that conversations between healthcare professionals and parents about medical cannabis can be very challenging. As an educator, Tracy aspires to integrate her lived experience, compassion, and clinical curiosity to disseminate education to healthcare professionals and assist in cannabis policy development for pediatric patients. Tracy lives in BC with her husband, Jerry, son, Lewin, and daughter, Cassandra. We'd like to welcome all of our panel members today. And with that, I will invite Taylor to take the stage. And take it away, Taylor.
Hello, everyone. My name is Taylor Lougheed. I'm a physician that's been involved in cannabinoid medicine for a number of years now. And so I've been involved in this space for a number of years. I've been fortunate to work with a number of families in my practice in terms of cannabinoid medicine. Has a fairly significant pediatric portion to it. I have a background in family medicine. I also practice emergency medicine and sports medicine in addition to my cannabinoid practice. So it's a fairly broad-ranging practice, but I have been involved in consultant cannabinoid medicine for about 7 years now and involved in a number of research projects and involved with C4T. What I've been asked to present today is really a broad overview in terms of the trends that we're seeing with medical cannabis usage and medical cannabis research. I'm going to try to tie that to the pediatric population. Just get my slide deck up here and we'll dive right in. And so this is me. This is what we're hoping to talk about. I've been involved in this space for a number of years, and through those years, I've been asked to give a number of educational talks. I've also been involved in some consultant work for a number of hospitals and companies involved in this space, and I've been intimately involved in a number of cannabis clinic initiatives. I have no specific disclosures in this area, but it's important to recognize that some of the research that we might be talking about and just this broad discussion may in theory benefit some of the companies involved in this cannabis space, whether it be pharmaceutical companies or licensed producers. This particular presentation isn't going to be making any clinical recommendations. We're going to have an open discussion of gaps in our knowledge, some research bias, and what trends we may be seeing in this space. So the objectives, we're going to try to pack it in, right? So we only have about 20 minutes for my portion of the presentation, and this is really a topic that could take hours. And there's going to be a high-level discussion of the current medical cannabis usage trends. I'm going to try to dissect some of the pediatric or youth component to that, which is difficult to do. We're also going to look at the current medical cannabis research trends, and again, try to pull out the pediatric portion to that. And the trends are linked, and so there's going to be 2 parts to my brief presentation, but they are quite linked, and so we'll be looking at that. So let's dive right in. It's important to have a foundation in terms of setting the stage for the usage trends. And so if you look at medicine in Canada, there are a number of different professional bodies that will put out guidelines that their members would be looking at and following along with. If you look back in 2016, the Canadian Pediatric Society, for instance, put out this guidance document when it came to medical cannabis usage in children. And so it's important to know that this does impact what pediatricians and family doctors and really every clinician across Canada might reflect on when they're thinking about medical cannabis in the pediatric world. And so this document, which admittedly is a number of years old now, did identify and recognize that there's some biological plausibility. What that means is there's a number of studies, often in animals or in cell lines, that show that there's potential effect. They also found lots of anecdotes, lots of interesting stories or lower quality evidence that suggested there could be benefit. But they also reflected that there was also, on the flip side, some plausibility for harm or concern around harm. They were really opposed to smoking of cannabis for a number of reasonable reasons. But ultimately, their approach was that on a case-by-case basis, with a full kind of review of the research, of the risks and benefits, and with shared decision-making and team support, there could be consideration of medical cannabis in certain circumstances as an add-on treatment. If we couple that with a bit of a review of this Canadian Pediatric Surveillance Program survey from 2017, this is an organization that is constantly looking at pediatric data year to year and looking for trends or safety concerns or research trends. And this was a standalone survey that they conducted in 2017 that had about almost 900 pediatricians and subspecialists that responded to it. And I think it also gives a good kind of lay of the land in terms of the comfort and the usage trends at that time. About 50% of them had encountered a patient within their practice that had used cannabis for medical purposes in that year. About 2/3 of them felt that less than half of those patients had actually benefited from cannabis. A small portion, 15%, felt the majority of those patients actually had adverse effects. Only 38% of them had actually been asked to authorize cannabis, but of that, only 3.8% actually authorized cannabis before. So we're talking about small numbers of pediatricians and subspecialists that have actually authorized it. So, a fairly large number have patients within their practice that are using it or have asked them about it. If we look at their comfort and knowledge level, the group that said they had no knowledge or minimal knowledge to certain questions, with 76% of them said they didn't have any knowledge in terms of why cannabis may be authorized in a child or youth. 89% weren't really sure which cannabis products might be authorized, and 90% really weren't sure how cannabis can be authorized. So we're seeing that despite their having patients in their practice, there's not a lot of comfort or knowledge about this. In terms of their beliefs, 46% felt there might be appropriate indications for use. And of those, the majority felt they might be appropriate for refractory or difficult to treat symptoms, specifically relating to palliative care, epilepsy, forms of chronic pain, and spasticity. But that there were barriers in terms of why they may not feel comfortable authorizing, and that related to the evidence around efficacy, if it's going to be effective or not, what the dosing or toxicity concerns might be, long-term impact concerns, and concerns about abuse and dependence. So things are changing though. So there are some areas in that survey, they did identify that palliative instances and epilepsy, there was maybe some increased comfort with that. And so I'm just going to very briefly show you the studies that looked into comfort in those areas. So this was published in Cancer Reports in 2021. It was specifically looking at pediatric oncologists and palliative care physicians and their impression of the potential use of cannabis in children with cancer. And they felt that there was a potential role. The majority of them felt there was a role for nausea and vomiting, potentially for chronic pain or for appetite and anorexia and depression, but that almost all of them wanted to learn more about dosing, side effects, and safety. And so we now have a number of surveys that are saying that the impression is that, yeah, there could be benefit, but there's certainly gaps in terms of how best to use this, having more robust evidence, and there's barriers to actually implementing that into practice. Epilepsy was the other kind of high response that we saw from that survey in terms of potential use. And this has been an area that's been rapidly evolving. And so this was published in Seizure, European Journal of Epilepsy, just last year. And this was a qualitative study of 12 neurologists. And it was based off of interviews and kind of trying to get their impression of where CBD might fit into the mix. And there was general agreement that there was the potential role for CBD in drug-resistant epilepsy, particularly two forms of it, Repetski syndrome or Lennox-Gastaut syndrome. But there were common themes that were pulled out of that in terms of concerns around education, gaps in knowledge, how best to actually authorize this for their patients, and concerns about cost. And if you couple that with the position statement from the Canadian League Against Epilepsy, this was published in 2019, in reflecting the change in evidence that we've seen in this space, they feel that there really could be a role for this, particularly in two forms of epilepsy where there are ongoing seizures despite kind of first and second line treatment options. So we've got kind of a broad interest, lots of patients getting interested, but there's still kind of this barrier in terms of actual usage outside of two areas, epilepsy and in palliative instances. There's some increased movement there. But I wanted to take a step back and say, well, let's think more broadly in terms of the medical cannabis space. And so this was a survey, the Cannabis survey by the government in 2020. They tend to do this on an annual basis. And this was a survey of Canadians 16 years and older. So not the perfect demographic for this type of discussion, but still some important insights from this. And so there were over 10,000 total responses to the cannabis survey, and about 14.8% of them indicated medical usage. And that number hasn't really changed since 2019. Of that, only a quarter have a medical authorization. And so while there's 14%, 15% saying that they're using cannabis or they perceive there's medical benefit to their cannabis usage, only a quarter actually have medical authorization and medical follow-up. And of them, 90% have no insurance coverage. And this is an ongoing concern and theme. There were maybe 5% that had partial coverage and only 4% that had full coverage. What was a bit concerning to look at in terms of active client registrations for medical cannabis. And again, this is from 16 and older, so not our exact demographic for our discussion today, but you'll see that from March 2019 to March 2021, there's been a decrease. And yes, there's fluctuations from month to month, but on a year-over-year basis, there seems to be a decrease since legalization for medical authorizations for medical cannabis. And we could spend probably hours debating and dissecting why that's the case. And there's no age-based data for that that's readily available. But when we look at that, and then also to kind of look at the other side of the screen, where we're looking at active authorizers of medical cannabis, and this is something that's only been looked at over the last 2 years. This is a relatively new stat that they started to ask about. There's been a reduction in authorizers. We have a reduction in authorizers. We have a reduction in at least adults getting medical authorization. We only have about a quarter of those that perceive medical benefit to their cannabis use having an authorization to begin with. You're able to see that there's some interesting crossroads here and some challenges when it comes to access to cannabis and kind of looking at the growing interest that's happening on the flip side. So adults are able to gain access legally, either through recreational or medical usage. Pediatric population is a bit confined to getting an authorization. And if there are less authorizers, that's going to impact access. So if you look at online interest, this is a slide that I frequently use in some of my presentations. It just a lot of ongoing interest. And if you were to click through on any of these links on Google, there's going to be a lot of information and sometimes misinformation that's going to cause a bit of a gap in terms of how do we access this in a responsible way? How do we get the information we need? There's lots of market forces. If you type in things like medical cannabis and ADHD, a lot of the information on the other side isn't what is the evidence, what's the safety, how do we get safe access? Is this a reasonable option? It's what is the best strain for usage. So it's jumping right to the kind of conclusion here, which puts families and patients in a tough bind. If we look broadly, this is in part based off of anecdote. There's not a lot of data that can kind of clearly say, hey, is the usage in the pediatric world going up? Unless we kind of tapped into each of the licensed producers and had them share their data. And I think anecdotally, and chatting with my colleagues and some of this data here, I think we are seeing an increase. And so we have media reports saying that there's increased interest and inquiries from patients and their families and their caregivers. Clinical anecdote from myself, my colleagues that authorize for patients. I'm seeing a lot of increased interest from the pediatric world. And then simple things, even if you look at Google Trends, you type in CBD in kids, from 2016 on that left side of that little graph to 2021, you can see that there has been, certainly an increase around 2018 and a consistent interest in things like CBD for kids at that point. And you can type in a number of other kind of search results and see similar things in the pediatric world. So the trends that are kind of highlighted there, the surveys suggest that there's stable medical usage of cannabis from kind of the Canadian high level adult world, but there's decreasing medical authorizations year over year. There's decreasing medical authorizers. There's poor insurance coverage, but we're seeing an increased interest from the pediatric world. There's ongoing physician and nurse practitioner discomfort and knowledge gaps. There's guidelines and recommendations that are advising caution at this time, and some of them are a number of years old. And there's a need for increased training and education. But there is increased usage and comfort in areas like epilepsy and palliative care, where we're not only seeing increased usage, increased inquiries, but we're also starting to see some increased comfort. And so that is an interesting change that's been happening just over the last number of years. Now I'm going to kind of switch gears a little bit, and there's going to be overlap in terms of some of the quick studies that I gave you the overview of and what we're going to look at here. But in general, if we take a step back and do something simple like go into Google Scholar, just one of the kind of aggregating websites that looks at research, and type in pediatric medical cannabis. If you type in the time range 1900 to 2010, over 110 years, there's only 152 results. And admittedly, most of those aren't specifically related to the usage clinically of medical cannabis in the pediatric world. But if we were to kind of refine that and say, okay, from 2010 to 2015, we had some, interesting, starting to get some changes in terms of medical cannabis in Canada, 376 results. From 2015 to 2021, almost 3,000 results, and 63% of those were published within the last 2 years. And so when we're talking broadly about research trends in pediatric cannabis, it's really starting to explode. And that's because we're seeing increased interest from patients, their caregivers, their families. We're recognizing that there's significant gaps. If you look at some of the research I presented earlier, yes, oncologists, yes, epileptologists are saying, I feel there could be a role at this point. But they felt increased comfort because research was there, but they identified that despite their increased comfort, there were still gaps that need to be filled, right? And so we're seeing that there's been a tremendous increase in research interest, but it takes time. And there's often a delay between something getting researched and published and that getting integrated into clinical practice. This is, just an overview in terms of how things have changed. So I told you between, 2019 and 2021, a couple thousand new studies. This was, fairly impactful systematic review in the Journal of Pediatrics in 2017. So just a couple of years ago, in the midst of that, starting to see an uptick in research, but missing some of the more recent stuff. But at that time, in terms of higher quality things specific to pediatrics. So sometimes you'll have an adult study, mostly focused on adults, that'll have some mention of kids, but these were specific for pediatrics. So when they did their review, they only found 22 studies and only had about 800 patients. So we're talking about small studies, not a lot of patients, really tough to change clinical practice when you have that kind of level of evidence. And when you look at the type of research that's being done in terms of the quality of the methodology, trying to reduce bias, trying to increase the impact of that type of research, only 5 randomized controlled trials, a number of retrospective chart reviews, but we're mostly looking at case series, surveys, case studies. And this is evidence. We don't discount it, but it makes it difficult to change practice because these forms of evidence tend to have a higher risk of bias and concern. I'm just presenting this because it's important for people to reflect on kind of the traditional approach to evidence. This is within the minds of almost everyone that works within healthcare, and this can be controversial, and we could debate, whether this still makes 100% sense. But this is still the mental mind map that we generally have when it comes to evidence. So as we go up that pyramid, it's more costly, more time intensive, but higher quality. And so the results of those studies are more likely to be applicable to other things. I've taken some liberty. I've inserted some different conditions on this chart for discussion purposes, but I think is reflective of some of the changes in evidence we've seen over the last couple of years. So for example, epilepsy, just within the last handful of years, has really seen a significant improvement in terms of the methodology, the quality of evidence. And as a result of that, I think we've seen an increase in comfort from the neurology world and from authorizers for pediatric epilepsy conditions. It's not perfect. A lot of that evidence was based off of research around Epidiolex, a very specific concentrated form of CBD that's currently not approved in Canada. And they did some randomized control trials. Chemotherapy-induced nausea and vomiting has had a number of randomized control trials specifically related to it. Not specifically herbal cannabis, though. And that's the challenge when we talk about medical cannabinoids, is we're talking about all comers in many cases. And so this is often from a pharmaceutical product. And we could debate where some of these other things might fit, but if we're strictly looking at pediatric evidence, then unfortunately we're mostly down into case reports. And that's not to say that there's not evidence, but that evidence is biased. It's harder to drive changes in clinical practice, and it means that we need to continue to advocate for and push for higher qualities of evidence. And really everything else is down right at the bottom. And you have to add the quick caveat is that many of these studies were based off of adults with only small pediatric populations, or they were using prescription or pharmaceutical forms of cannabinoids, not kind of the herbal preparations that you might be more familiar with. And so this is the general trend. I mean, you see lots of surveys asking about perceptions and experiences, and that's valuable. That's a good starting point for the conversation. But we need to kind of continue to push up to retrospective observational studies, looking at what actually happened in certain patient populations. And then ideally, we need to be looking prospectively. We have to say, hey, we're going to now enroll people into these studies and ultimately enroll them into studies that have a placebo component. They're randomized or controlled. We're really trying to control the experimental conditions. But that's a challenge. And I think if we look at the RCT conundrum, or the randomized control trial challenge, is that it's well recognized. Everyone in this space recognizes that we need more well-designed studies, that's going to be better for patient care. We're going to be able to address concerns around safety and a proper dosing, and it's going to be able to drive clinical change. And by driving clinical change, we're more likely to drive changes in insurance coverage and access for our patients. But there's a number of barriers. And the reality right now is that because of how research of this nature is set up and what the requirements are, there's no product, there's no cannabis product in Canada right now, herbal cannabis product from a licensed producer that would meet the requirements for approval by Health Canada for a randomized control trial. So outside of regulatory change or outside of a licensed producer really developing that robust data, in the near term, we're not likely to see randomized control trials within the Canadian context. They're also really expensive. And the reality from a commercial or industry standpoint is most industry partners are not, strictly speaking, profitable. And so it's difficult for them to put funding into that area. And even still, ideally, the funding for these types of projects wouldn't come from commercial sources if possible. And so we would have to be tapping into some limited funding from elsewhere. That's why there's been a push towards real world experience or real world evidence. And that's really where we're tracking outcomes in patients that are already including cannabis as part of their treatment course. And so if they're already receiving cannabis because they're having refractory or difficult to treat conditions, we say, let's follow them along. Let's try to learn from their experience, even though this isn't a strict experimental model. And so we do need to reflect on the inherent risk of bias in this model. We don't want to discount this data. And if anything, this is probably our best chance at kind of moving the conversation forward. We do have to limit the experimental controls in this realm, because once you start really putting in those experimental controls, you're effectively running a trial. And so you need to meet the requirements for a trial. And as I mentioned, there are barriers to being able to do that. And so because you're not able to really control the conditions, we have to be cognizant. We have to be aware that the quality of the evidence or the risk of bias is going to be different. Now, there's a number of things to be aware of. And so from a medical safety standpoint, this is an ongoing surveillance program. Dr. Lauren Kelly, who's the moderator, who hopefully was able to reconnect, is an integral part of this type of project. And really, it's looking over time for individuals that are already being authorized for medical cannabis. Is there a safety concern? Do we see any adverse effects? And so this is a really important type of project, and this is addressing some of the concerns that have been put forward. When it comes to medical regulation, this was actually published just in the Canadian Medical Association Journal last month. A number of C4T members, including, I believe, again, Dr. Lauren Kelly, was involved in this publication. And it's recognizing that pediatric usage and interest is increasing. there's a huge gap in terms of the regulation and research that's taking place. This is not only unique to medical cannabis. Lots of research tends to focus on adults. And then we have to kind of extrapolate. We have to say, if it worked in an adult, could it work in a child? That's not perfect, right? Ideally, we'd be able to have data catered specifically to the pediatric world, but this is also an issue in medical cannabis. There is ongoing research in the Canadian context. This is just, a small sampling of the projects that I'm personally aware of around following patients with epilepsy, chronic daily headaches, autism spectrum disorder, and pain. In some cases, these are just that early number one line I told you about in terms of just trying to get perspectives from patients, their families, their caregivers, and what has this journey been like in terms of authorizing for these conditions, whereas others are looking a little bit more prospectively in terms of how do we enroll and follow these patients along. But in terms of future directions, everyone recognizes we need long-term safety data. We need higher quality clinical trials, particularly focused on the pediatric population. We unfortunately have too much anecdote. An anecdote can be good. We already have enough of it. We don't need more anecdote. We actually need, in terms of trying to drive the conversation forward and drive changes in clinical practice and coverage and in safety, we need the higher quality, methodologically sound studies. We need more data around the optimal dosing formulations. A lot of studies use 600 milligrams as a bit of an arbitrary level. That's prohibitively expensive in a lot of families. And so we need to be looking at, is that actually the optimal dose? Are there other dosing formats that may work well? We're still not 100% sure on what's the role for these other minor cannabinoids or terpenes or flavonoids that are in the plant as well. Do they affect the clinical outcomes? And where are we at with insurance coverage? This is an ongoing challenge and concern. And so this was, as you can imagine, a very rapid fire, brief overview. Both topics, the usage trends and research trends, could have had their own dedicated hour, but that's just to give you a bit of the lay of the land from how I see it right now. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And thank you everyone for joining us today. I'll quickly go over an introduction just before the panel on how we got here and why this webinar is happening. But next, I will invite Evan to share a little bit about some of the cannabinoids work in the pediatric context and some of the pharmacokinetics and what we know a little bit about what happens when children take cannabis products. There we go. Hey, Evan, take it away.
All right, great. So I think my screen is showing there. Good. Hi, everybody. So my name is Evan Lewis. I'm a pediatric neurologist and an epilepsy specialist. And I am the founder of the Neurology Center of Toronto. And at the Neurology Center of Toronto, we do a lot of work with medical cannabis. I've been doing for some time and focused mainly around pediatric epilepsy, but for a variety of other neurological disorders. We also work with many patients in that sense as well, both pediatric and adult. So today, just kind of going to go through a little bit about how cannabinoids work. Not too much detail, but just enough to kind of whet your appetite. It's an interesting area, and a lot of work needs to be done, as Taylor had alluded to, not only within the research sense of both clinically how it works in patients, but also just how they work in general. We're still trying to flush that out too. Just in terms of disclosures, I really have no financial support to disclose. I am the vice president of a company called Numinous, which is a psychedelics company. It doesn't work with cannabis. As well, I've received some honoraria for various talks that I've given on behalf of medical cannabis companies, and otherwise have not received any financial or in-kind support from any of the organizations. And you might see some of them if you do in this presentation. I can't really recall, but if you do, it's totally just coincidence. And I'm not singling out any of these products in the presentation at all for any particular reason. Okay, so let's move right ahead. So just to give everybody a little bit of a primer, it's hard to talk about these things unless you really know what they are. So kind of going back to Cannabis 101 for our audience out there. So first off, what is the endocannabinoid system? So what is this? Well, it's actually a physiological system inside of each and every one of us. And what we can do first is just kind of break that word down. That's kind of the easiest way to figure out what a big long word in medicine means. So endo means within, inside, it means internal. And then cannabinoid has a very specific word, a specific meaning. It means any compound that acts on this endocannabinoid system, this cannabinoid system that we have inside of ourselves. So that's a molecule that acts on the system. Now there's two different molecules. One can come from within our own body, and that's what an endocannabinoid is. It's a cannabinoid, so a molecule works on that system that's generated inside of us. So yes, in other words, we have these cannabis like molecules inside of our own body that our own body makes and works on the system that our own body has developed. It's pretty interesting stuff. And then we have our phytocannabinoids. Phyto means plant. So these are the cannabinoids, the molecules that act on that system that come from plants. So these are things like THC and CBD and CBDA and THCA and some of the others that are out there, all the other minor cannabinoids. Okay, so that kind of helps us with our language, because that's very important to make sure that we're all talking about the same thing and everybody can understand each other. For anybody who's seen me talk about this before, they know that I love that little animal up there at the top. That is a sea squirt. Okay, sea squirts come from the family of tunicates right here. Now, they're really interesting. They kind of sit on the ocean floor or in the coral reefs. And they're not too complicated. They have a mouth and they have a bum. So they basically eat and they basically poop. And that's pretty much what they do. And what's interesting about the sea squirt physiology is that they happen to have an endocannabinoid system. So just like you and I, this little creature down here that's been around on the earth for 600 million years has an endocannabinoid system. Well, that means if we trace that back far enough, there's some creature that existed that gave rise to these tunicates, and ultimately through a long series of evolution gave rise to us over here. And we all shared the same properties with them. So we shared these properties, and over time, some of those properties have existed until today, and that's this endocannabinoid system. Okay, when something exists for that long on an evolutionary scale, kind of tells you that it might be a little bit important. And if it's important and it's been around for that long, then maybe it might be everywhere in our body. So let's take a look, and lo and behold, that's what we have. So the endocannabinoid system is pretty much found everywhere in our body. It's in our lungs, it's in our gut, it's in our immune system, it's in our muscles and bones, it's in our brain. And the system, having been around for so long, it's kind of everywhere in our body. It's probably doing some really important things, and it is in the brain. Look at these features here. So it's responsible for how our brain develops. It's responsible for how our brain responds to injury, how it changes over time. That's what plasticity is. And it's also responsible for how the brain talks to itself and sends its signals out to the body and receives its signals from the body, that chemical balance in the brain. So pretty important system. Well, let's take a little bit of a sidestep here and start talking about the molecules, the phytocannabinoids. So the top right there is a picture of the cannabis flower. Cannabis is a dioecious species, meaning they're both males and females. And the females, if you keep them away from the males, produce these really big flowers that look like this. And on those flowers, if you kind of blow it up and get a little bit closer and then a little bit closer, you're going to see these little mushroom-like structures here. And those are called the glandular trichomes. So those are the places where you find all of those phytocannabinoids. That's where we find THC and CBD and all the others. Not in the roots, not in the stems, not in the leaves, not in the seeds. You don't find them there. This is why you can kind of go to a local supermarket pretty much anywhere and buy hemp seed oil. You're getting lots of nice omega-3 fatty acids in there, but you're not really getting any cannabinoids, unfortunately. Although some people do they think that and will buy some hemp seed oil thinking they're getting CBD. But again, in the flowers, really important, in these little structures called the glandular trichomes. And if you break down these glandular trichomes and you look at them under a microscope, you get 450 different things. So it's pretty complicated. Okay. And I know that Taylor alluded to this too. He talked about these terpenes and flavonoids. So let's first start over there. So those are your non-cannabinoids. Okay. These are the molecules that do not act on the endocannabinoid system. They don't interact with it. Okay. This is your terpenes and flavonoids. What is the function? What are the functions of terpenes and flavonoids? They provide the taste, they provide the smell, and they provide the appearance to any plant, not just cannabis. So these are not just found in cannabis. These terpenes and flavonoid molecules are found across all plants. As an example, we have pinene. Okay, pinene, we're there as pine. Okay, so when you take some pine needles and you squish them in your hand and you get a nice big inhale and you're smelling that pine scent, that's pinene. And pinene has some anti-anxiety type properties potentially. So maybe that's why it feels nice to inhale a bunch of pinene or go for a walk in the woods, and smell all of that pinene that comes off of the pine trees, perhaps. So there's a lot of terpenes, and the terpenes have medical properties themselves that are yet to be discovered. So this is a really big area of cannabinoid medicine, is to figure out what's the real role of these terpenes and what are they doing and how are they providing some of that medical effect that we get from cannabis. Switching over to the other side here, we have our cannabinoids. So these are those molecules that act on that endocannabinoid system. And the best way to kind of separate these is to put them into two boxes here. Okay, and these boxes, the words here are euphoric and non-euphoric. A lot of people like to say psychoactive and not psychoactive. I don't really like that. And kind of, again, alluding back to some of the things that Taylor talked about the the work we see and what we know, where we know cannabinoids work, they work in the brain. So psychoactive means to have activity in the brain. CBD treats CBD and THC, and some of the others treat epilepsy. So it's clearly having action in the brain. So I think what people really mean to be saying is euphoric and non-euphoric, which are much better terms, because euphoric means to get that sense of that high. And that high sense, that euphoric feeling, that's where delta 9 THC, or what we otherwise know as THC, that's where it sits. It sits right there. And there are a bunch of others. There's a bunch of minor cannabinoids that are not in that are in the plant, but not in as big a proportion as, let's say, THC or CBD. But there's lots of others that can give you that euphoric effect. On the non-euphoric side, that's where CBD sits, and there are others as well. And again, important to do this because I think when people say often, CBD is great, it's not psychoactive, and it's good for you, and it stems into this this picture of painting for CBD that it's totally harmless, which is not true. CBD does have its side effects. We know that from the studies. That's well worked out, and it has to be used in caution, because we're going to see why the second half of what I'm going to tell everybody today, how it interacts with other drugs. So it's not totally harmless. You can't just go and take a bunch of CBD and hope that everything's going to be okay with you. You have to understand exactly what it's doing and what are some of the potential downsides that can come with CBD. And so again, important, euphoric, non-euphoric, way better than psychoactive and non-psychoactive. Okay, here's where we're going to get a little bit detailed. We're going to look at some of the mechanisms by which cannabis works in the brain. And so follow me along here, and I think you'll kind of be able to follow these steps. All right, so what do we got here? Okay, so this is what I'm going to show is just one mechanism by which cannabis works in the brain. There are many mechanisms. We're going to see on the next slide, after all I'm done all this, that there's a lot of other ways in which CBD, THC potentially work. But let's just look at this one, because this one's pretty well worked out. It makes a lot of sense when we kind of see how molecules like CBD and THC interact with each other. So what do you have here? Okay, so up here is a neuron. And down here is a neuron. So two different neurons. What are neurons? Neurons are brain cells. Brain cells are created in a really smart and intelligent way. They get really, really, really close to each other, but they don't touch. Okay? There's a gap between them. And this gap, as you can see represented by this space here, is called the synapse. So what you have is you've got one neuron and another neuron. You've got a neuron that's before the synapse, therefore it's the presynaptic neuron, and you got one after, which is the postsynaptic neuron. Signals in neurons go from one neuron to another. So you have a presynaptic or sending neuron that sends a signal to the postsynaptic neuron. How does it do that? Well, the signal comes down this neuron and a bunch of processes happen which dump these purple balls into the space here. Those purple balls are called neurotransmitters, or transmitters of the neuronal signal. And it just so happens to be that there are little cups on the receiving neuron, and those cups are receptors. And the balls, when they get dumped out into this space by the signal coming down here, they fit snugly into those receptors, and then the signal gets picked up here, and the receiving neuron passes the signal on. And that's how brain cells generally talk to each other. This is a really efficient, interesting, and good way for one signal to go to the next. However, you need to have brakes on a system like this. You can't just have the signal going on all the time. What happens if this one neuron here is trying to send the signal, but this neuron here is saying, whoa, we got to slow this down. This is too much signal. There's got to be a feedback mechanism here. And this is one way in which the endocannabinoid system functions. So let me show you. So as the signal is coming down here, and this postsynaptic neuron is saying, hey, that's too much signal, slow down. It starts to generate these endocannabinoids inside of itself, represented by the green key. So it starts to make these things. It makes these things, spits them backwards, and lo and behold, there is a receptor for these endocannabinoids on the sending neuron. And like a lock and a key, the endocannabinoid fits into there, creates a whole downstream chemical reactions here, which ultimately stop the sending neuron from putting the purple balls into the synapse, from dumping the neurotransmitters into the synapse. So what happens is the signal turns off or it slows down. And that's the function, one of the functions of the endocannabinoids. It just so happens, by sheer coincidence and a fluke of nature, that THC fits into that cannabinoid receptor and does a very similar action as the endocannabinoids. So it will work to slow down or shut off that signal. Okay, well, what about CBD? Okay, one way in which CBD works, which has been shown, is that it also interacts with this cannabinoid receptor up here. It comes along and binds that receptor too, but a little bit different. Let's look. Here you go. Here's THC fitting very nicely into that CB1 receptor as I just showed you. So very, very, very nice. Nice clean fit. CBD, being like a little bit of a rascal, comes in here and binds that receptor, but at a different point. And when it does that, it squishes up the receptor and changes its shape. And when you change the shape of the receptor, it can no longer receive THC nor the endocannabinoids, because remember, they're similar to THC. So effectively, what is CBD doing? Well, when CBD comes along and squishes that receptor up and makes it inaccessible to THC and the endocannabinoids, it more or less shuts it down. All right, well, we've got to reverse our thinking here. If it shuts down the receptor, then this whole process gets reversed. So what does CBD do? CBD comes along and it turns that signal back on. Okay, if you're able to follow me there, the big take-home point for everybody to notice that in this particular model, in this particular way things work, it looks like CBD and THC work to stabilize and to modulate the activity of neurons in the brain. So together they might have an action that helps to bring more stability to a neuron if the endocannabinoid system is disrupted for whatever reason. And this could be a potential model for many different disorders, because a lot of neurological disorders are due to improper signaling between neurons. So really neat mechanism, and that again is well worked out and has been quite established. However, it doesn't explain the whole picture, especially in a disease like epilepsy. So in a condition like epilepsy, we know the neurons are sometimes in these excitatory presynaptic neurons. So this is the same picture here. Here's your one neuron, here's your other neuron. There's that synapse signal comes down from here. There's a lot of other ways in which signals get passed from one neuron to another, tons of different ways. And there's a ton of steps in between for all that to happen, okay? And what we see is that, again, that picture I just showed you before doesn't explain the whole picture for epilepsy. So there are some other proposed mechanisms of how CBD functions. And in essence, what those mechanisms are showing that in some way, CBD works to reduce the excitability of neurons. So it tries to slow down the signaling of neurons, because epilepsy is a condition in which the neurons might be too active. And these are just three different ways here. Okay, it can block or make these particular receptors called the GPR55 receptors. Okay, it can interfere with how they function. Okay, it can also interfere with the functioning of these other receptors called the TRPV1 receptors or the TRPV1 receptors. And it can also inhibit this molecule here, adenosine, from getting into the cells here. Okay, and this is three main kind of areas of a lot of research that might be contributing to how CBD works in the context of treating epilepsy. What's really exciting about this is that all these mechanisms are new. And that's the biggest thing what cannabis has done for the area of epilepsy and has done for other disorders, in my opinion, especially in neurology, is it's provided an alternative mechanism to affect how the neurons are talking to each other, an alternative mechanism to what I normally have in my toolkit or what other neurologists normally have in their toolkit. So really, really, really exciting. We can kind of talk about this in the panel about where I think this might lead to later on for future research. In the last couple of slides here, I just want to talk about some other areas that is a challenge for us in using cannabis medicine, and ultimately goes beyond some of the things that Taylor had mentioned in terms of finding data to really start to authorize cannabis for people. What do people who are already on cannabis? How do we monitor these things? How do we measure the levels? How do we know what we're doing is right? And there's such variation from one person to the next. So a lot of work is being going into this, as you can see, but we're really not there. So my kind of message here is that I think we're on the right road, kind of looking back at these studies and seeing what's been going on and some of the good data that's been coming out in the last little while. But we still need more studies, more patients, and more data to really get an idea of how to manage people who are on cannabis, i.e. on CBD and THC, or potentially some of the others. So just as a last piece here, this is really just more for reference to introduce a concept of what we have to be careful of when we're working with CBD and THC, is that the CBD and THC get broken down in the liver by these enzymes here, okay? These enzymes, all what are kind of listed here, are called the CYP enzymes, the CYP enzymes. And there's very specific ones here, and you can see CBD, okay, for instance, utilizes some of these enzymes to be broken down itself. Okay? It also inhibits some of these enzymes, and THC likewise kind of the same, right? So what's important here is to know what other drugs interact with these enzymes. And there's some ones that we definitely know of, okay? So there's some ones that have been well worked out, like clobazam, like some of the other anti-epileptic drugs, which you see down here, okay? Warfarin, which is a really common medication, well, somewhat common in the adult population when you need to kind of help with reducing bleeding, okay? And these are other medications that are kind of typically used, and you can see they're metabolized by those same enzymes. So we have to know how these things interact. And really just putting together a table like this, kind of memorizing them or having them on reference is something that physicians need to know and do so they can check this and cross-reference this when people come in who are on cannabis. Just as a very general kind of picture out there, here's some work that I do. I know that a lot of my patients with epilepsy are on various different medications here, as pointed out, like valproic acid and some of these others here. So there's some basic standard blood work we can do to just monitor these things. And that's the way to kind of monitor them and counsel people appropriately. Last thing I'll just show here, because this is an interesting kind of example. One of the newest medications that has been shown to interact is what's called levothyroxine. This is used to treat people who are deficient in thyroid. They have a deficient thyroid. It's not operating well, so they supplement their thyroid hormone with this medication called levothyroxine. And it was just shown potentially to be a big inhibitor of this enzyme, or to be inhibited by this enzyme here. So what it can do is it can work to slow down the action of this enzyme here, which is used to metabolize CBD, so that can drive CBD levels up. Okay, so you got to be careful for these are the things that come out that we didn't know about before, and this has just been published in 2021. And we have a lot of patients. I have a lot of patients who are on levothyroxine, and now I have to pay attention to CBD-related side effects for people who are on this, or at least counsel them appropriately. So it's constantly being evaluated and investigated, and we're learning more and more and more every day. I'm going to flip through the last few slides. As you can see, there's a lot of other theoretical interactions here. So I kind of end there, and looking forward to talking more about this in the panel.
Wonderful. Thank you, Evan. That was a fantastic overview of a very complex system. So thank you very much for that. That was really great. And it's my pleasure now to turn it over to our parent partners who are joining us today, and we'll be talking about Every Road is Different, experiences from a parent's perspective with medicinal cannabis for their children. So I think first on stage we have Mandy. Welcome, Mandy. Oh, you're on mute, Mandy, but take it away after that.
Can you hear me now? Hi. Okay, good afternoon, and thanks, Lauren. Thanks for inviting me to speak about cannabis and the impact that it's had on Liam and our family. My name is Mandy McKnight, and I am Liam's mom. My son Liam was authorized to use cannabis for medical purposes in 2013 when he was just 5 years old. Liam suffers from Dravet syndrome, which is a catastrophic form of epilepsy. It's very difficult to control with traditional medications. Before we turned to cannabis as a possible option to treat Liam's seizures, he had tried and failed over 12 anticonvulsant medications and also the ketogenic diet. At the time we wanted to try cannabis, the government program did not make sense for children. Extracts were illegal and low THC strains were not available. Liam was authorized at a time when cannabis clinics did not exist, and it was very difficult to find a doctor to prescribe cannabis to a child. We traveled thousands of miles across the country from Ontario to Alberta to meet with a doctor to prescribe, who was willing to prescribe cannabis to Liam to try to help with his seizures. During the time, derivative forms of cannabis also they weren't allowed, they were illegal, including for all medical patients and for children. Once authorized, our only options for medicine was in flower form, and there were only 2 high THC strains available to purchase through the government program. Or you could grow your own, and patients were expected to either smoke their cannabis or to vape. There were no licensed producers, there was no CBD, there was no oils, there was no capsules, gummies, drinks, creams, bath salts, lip balms. There was just flower. There were, however, dispensaries, illegal as they were. We were lucky enough to find a dispensary in Montreal, and we helped each other through a big learning curve because they had never had a patient as young as Liam. As time grew on, I was cooking oil in my kitchen on Sundays in my crock pot while advocating to find a more suitable strain to help him. We believed he required a strain of cannabis that was non-intoxicating, one that was high in CBD and low in THC, as we thought this was probably the most attractive option for a pediatric patient like him. In 2014, the restrictions on strains were lifted, which allowed for more suitable strains for Liam, but extracts remained illegal until at least another year. And then in 2015, the Supreme Court struck down the law banning cannabis derivatives. So we're lucky and we're proud that we were able to be a small part of that case, the Supreme Court case. And then at that time, it was at this point that Liam and other pediatric patients were now able to access a reliable, tested, standardized product from a licensed producer. But it doesn't come without its challenges and its barriers. One of the biggest obstacles that parents face is access. The inability to find a doctor willing to authorize the use of cannabis for their child. And even when a doctor is found, the medication can be so cost prohibitive that parents simply give up. Forcing families to choose between medication for their child and rent and bills and groceries is a huge failure of this program. It is difficult to see families not have the means to access cannabis through the legal government program because of cost. They are driven to access cannabis outside of the legal stream, where desperate parents are treating their children with possibly an untested product of unknown origin. While cannabis itself may not be considered as dangerous as other medications, it is not a benign substance and can have potential negative impacts on children, especially those who are neurologically compromised. While the framework has been put in place, there is always room for improvement. We would like to see the government step in and cancel all taxes that are applied to medical cannabis, as no other prescribed medication is taxed in such a way. Secondly, insurance coverage is desperately needed so families can recoup some of the costs of their child's medicine. From my conversation with parents, in addition to access and cost, there are concerns with licensed producers currently not prioritizing pediatric patients, and there are constant shortages on their medication, and parents are being forced to pivot and switch strains, or sometimes even a whole different producer, because there are no suitable substitutes available. Can you imagine walking into your pharmacy to refill your life-saving medication only to be told by the pharmacist that they don't have your medication this month and to find something else? Of course, you would say this is unacceptable, but it is happening to kids using cannabis too frequently. And we have to ask ourselves, why is that? And why are we allowing this? I have been advocating for children to have the right to access cannabis for 9 years by attending events such as this one, so others can see how much cannabis has changed Liam's life, in the hopes it will empower other moms and dads and caregivers to also fight for their kids. It has not been an easy road. In fact, at times it has been insanely challenging. But he honestly, the changes that we have seen in our son, he has certainly opened my eyes. And I just want this feeling for other parents and other moms and dads who just feel like giving up because they've exhausted all of their options. They're just waiting. I know for us, we were just constantly waiting for the next seizure, and always being afraid that that next seizure was going to be Liam's last seizure, that he was having so many seizures that it felt like he was dying, that he was just slipping away. So I just want to end by saying that so it's such an emotional topic for me, even after 9 years, that I don't want parents to give up, and things have changed. Things have changed so much in the last 8 years that we've been using cannabis, that I think that the future can be bright, and I think that we can definitely do better for these kids. And I feel that this panel and this group of people, that we're really on the right track. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Mandy, for sharing your experiences, and absolutely we have your back. There's lots of room for improvement, as you said, but I hope that at the end of today we can kind of align that road forward together. Next, we're going to hear from Alexander. Alex, did you want to join us on stage? Take it away.
Hello. Hi, can you hear me?
Sure can.
Okay, great. My name is Alex Repetski. Some people call me Alexander. I've been involved in the medical cannabis industry as a caregiver and at some points a professional since 2013. My reasons for getting involved were much similar to Mandy's, and it's been a long road. Instead of repeating points that Mandy's already covered, I'm going to kind of take a little bit of a different direction and talk about what I have seen to be effective from a parent and patient perspective in broaching the subject of cannabis and giving cannabis to children, which is admittedly a complex subject and not one that, you know, we normally have to deal with too often. So let's talking about cannabis. Now, why is a big question. It's not for fun. It's not for jokes. I got involved and started pursuing medical cannabis for my daughter, Guinevere, who you can see right there with the beautiful EEG leads on her head, because she failed 9 medications. She was having constant seizures, constant hypsarrhythmia, and a very poor prognosis. So I decided I had to find a solution. And in doing so, I decided the most effective way for me to find a solution was not by looking for cannabis, but by looking for something that would work. And along that path, cannabis came up. This was in 2014. And, you know, obviously there's, as Evan mentioned as well, there's been, and Taylor as well, there's lots of case reports from years and years ago. None of it was really well accepted properly. And I felt that the most effective way for me to broach that subject was to pretend to be a scientist myself, which I am not. So I did an enormous amount of research and decided to begin speaking to doctors, basically pretending I was a doctor. Because as we all know, and this holds true to any topic, but specifically when you're talking about healthcare and even more specifically with something like cannabis, everyone comes at everything from a different angle. So if I've read something as a parent who has lost all hope for my daughter's well-being, that cannabis helped someone, and I go into a doctor's office and say, you have to give me this because it's going to work, maybe it'll work, maybe it won't. But I decided that instead of doing that, I would approach the situation as if I was a scientist, assuming it wouldn't work, but asking the question of what if it did work? And like Mandy, I went down the path of making my own oils. I built extraction machines in my garage. I was getting everything tested by labs, figuring out dosing. It's a very uncomfortable situation. But I think the key to me anyways was that I never spoke to any of the doctors about it as if it was a solution, only as if it was a possible solution, a potential solution. And as it turns out, fast forward to 2021, my daughter Guinevere is now 9, taking 5 point something milligrams of CBD per body weight kilogram and has not had a seizure in 5 years. So it has been extraordinarily effective for her. And it's really great because doctors have taken notice and research is being done. So it has worked to that extent. So I think it's just really important that we all remember that if, you know, as a scientist, as a doctor, you don't, they don't, you don't, we don't. When we're thinking scientifically, we can't let emotion get too involved because the data is important. And that's very, very hard as a parent or a patient to kind of wrap your head around. And to my detriment, I've become almost robotic at sometimes trying to focus on data and not the emotional aspects of things, although I have given many doctors hugs when I saw an EG that did not show seizures. So I'm going to try to keep this pretty short. Let's talk about navigation a little bit more. And these are just slides I kind of smacked together. Cannabis is an old medicine that if if anyone looks it up on Google, you're going to find miracles and anecdotal evidence of it being effective for epilepsy and many other things dating back hundreds of years. But what we have to understand is that anecdotes are great, but they are not they're not results, and they're not data-based rubrics or treatments. So I think we have to be aware and understand that when doctors are maybe a little bit hesitant to use cannabis, especially in children, that's because they don't have that data. And the doctors have sworn to do no harm. It's part of their basic fundamentals. And in order to do that, they have to not prescribe things that they don't understand, which is fine. And luckily, and I'm happy to be experiencing this, that's changing rapidly. And I think that's through, a lot of research that's been done. And it's also through open communications, understanding. I think a lot of people are very happy many doctors are very happy to speak about cannabis as a possible treatment. And as the doctors you've just heard have said, it's showing great promise, but we have to keep approaching the subject with an air of caution, I suppose, and not going into it thinking it is magic and it will work in each case, because that's not the case. And that's not how a scientist's brain works, and that's not how a doctor's brain works. So we have to be cognizant of that. What this leads to is, I believe, I've been listened to by many doctors, and I've been a little lucky to have known very, very good doctors who were open-minded enough to listen. Although at the beginning, no one would script cannabis for my daughter, and it was troublesome. But once the data is there and the doctors are seeing beneficial outcomes, it's quite evident that all medical professionals want to look at this, because their goal is to help people, children, and humans. So I guess that really, in a long-winded way, I think it's just really important for us as a society to understand that cannabis is medicine. Cannabis is and can be part of good medical outcomes, but we have to all kind of roll through it together and make this progress and be understanding of each other, that we're all learning simultaneously. And I just want to say thank you to all medical healthcare professionals, doctors, scientists, etc., for listening to people like myself and other parents, seeing actual good results, and taking that to the next level, which is proper research and drug development. And I think the future is bright in terms of that. So I don't really have too much else to get into specifically. If anyone has any specific questions for me about my daughter's treatment, the path we've taken, or anything else at all, you can feel free to reach out to me on social media or however else is effective for you. And that's pretty much all I have to say. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Alex. And I think a lot of your points about data and research we'll hopefully get to discuss more in the panel. So thank you, Alex. And our last speaker today is Tracy. So take it away, Tracy.
Hi, my name's Tracy Brace. I just want to respectfully acknowledge the unceded traditional territories of the Kwantlen, Katzie, Matsqui, and Semiahmoo First Nations, on which I'm honored to be speaking from you today in Langley, BC. Today, I'm going to be talking briefly to you about advocacy, stigma, and the bidirectional relationship between clinicians, patients, and families, and harm reduction. I joined the Parent Advisory Committee for C4T in 2019, shortly after I began medicating my back then 4-year-old son with cannabis oils. My son Lougheed is currently in grade 1 and he's almost 7 now. He's been taking cannabis tinctures for 2.5 years to lessen side effects from chemotherapy and post-surgical traumatic brain injuries. He's currently on his 4th chemo protocol to treat brain and spinal cord tumors. And he's had a total of 7 neurosurgeries in 4 years. Currently, Lougheed's attending an outdoor education elementary school program. He's a happy, active, social child with a vivid imagination and a great sense of humor. Professionally, I've spent the last 12 years employed as a psychiatric nurse, and I work in mental health and substance use programs with a clinical practice that's deeply rooted in the philosophy of trauma-informed care and harm reduction. I'm presenting to you today wearing my parent advocate hat. However, as Lougheed's mother, much of how I've processed our journey has been through my healthcare professional lens. What I found most rewarding and healing about being a parent advisor for C4T is how inclusive this group of researchers has been and how valued we are for our contributions to the group as parent advisors. I'm also proud to be a part of a multinational culture of passionate and empowered caregivers and allies who are advocating for pediatric medical cannabis. I have a lot of gratitude for the work of those pioneers such as Mandy and Alex who have fiercely advocated for people's rights to medical cannabis, especially children, and especially in the years prior to legalization. People are willing to go to extremes to help those that they love. And when you see a child suffering, future unknown risks associated with medical cannabis seems like a small price to pay if you believe that you can make improvements in their health and quality of life now. There is no roadmap or algorithm to navigating how to advocate. So if you find yourself on this road and you're feeling defeated and wondering if you're going about things the right way, keep in mind we're all just winging it, and there's no right or wrong way to experience your journey. Sometimes embracing our inner troublemaker helps get stuff done and evokes change. Just keep following your path with integrity and with the knowledge that you're doing your best. Navigating traditional healthcare landscapes are hard enough. The system's not set up to be user-friendly. Parents of children with special needs are no strangers to the burdens which accompany advocacy. When you layer in advocating for healthcare outside of the status quo, such as cannabis for kids, it becomes even more challenging. It's so bureaucratic. There's so many hoops to jump through. It feels like it's truly made way harder than it needs to be. Advocacy is burdensome. It requires devotion and it's unpaid labor. We're already completely exhausted, and we become the ones who must fight against injustice for our own justice. Caregiver burnout and compassion fatigue comes from a place of exhaustion, much of which is directly connected to the emotional and moral distress from this justice doing. Being an advocate for my son has been extremely challenging. It's been difficult for me to balance having this awareness from both sides. I've struggled a lot with trying not to be too overly critical of the medical system and the expectations I have of the people working within the limitations of it. I must remind myself often not to take things so personally and to be patient, as I know it takes a long time for systems to make changes. Advocacy has also become a welcome distraction for me. Some of us need a lot of that in order to cope with adversity. Having spent over 6 years now in various family-centered care arenas, I've become more compassionate as a nurse. I'm also proud to refer to myself as a patient ally, and I'm way more aware of the impacts of stigma now. Understandably, there are a lot of mixed feelings about cannabis held within the medical community, especially in pediatrics. Meanwhile, public awareness continues to grow regarding its therapeutic potential. Despite legalization of cannabis in Canada in 2018, impacts of prohibition and criminalization are not yet in our rearview mirrors, and strong politicization and stigma is prevailing. Stigma is slowly beginning to diminish, but we're still a long way from cannabis normalization, and even farther from acceptance that cannabis should be treated like any other medication. Stigma accumulates at all levels, and it's created many obstacles for researchers to study the therapeutic benefits of medical cannabis. Without clear evidence from research, medical professionals will predominantly continue to be taught that cannabis is a drug of abuse versus being provided with up-to-date teaching about the existence and complexity of the endocannabinoid system and the plant's pharmacology. Ultimately, in order to decrease stigma, cannabis needs to be taken seriously as a medication, and physicians must be provided with professional guidance. Many physicians are unreceptive to requests made of them to provide authorization for medical cannabis, especially for children. This ongoing stigma, which surrounds discussions about cannabis, negatively impacts clinical communication, and it further marginalizes vulnerable populations. Physicians' uncertainty and unfamiliarity with medical cannabis can also adversely affect their clinical decision-making. Regardless of the reasons why a physician may be hesitant to authorize medical cannabis, they ought to be examining their own personal bias and ethical baggage in order to facilitate open, individualized conversations with patients and their families. There's no one-size-fits-all approach. Having open conversations about medical cannabis, including being transparent about the current state and limitations of evidence, enables informed choice by patients and their caregivers, promotes collaborative communication, and in turn supports the trustworthiness of the healthcare practitioner. It's not uncommon for clinical decisions to need to be made with imperfect or incomplete information. The virtue of epistemic humility reminds us to reflect on the limits of our knowledge and expertise, and to remain aware that scientific knowledge is constantly being revised in light of new evidence. No one is doing anyone any favors by pretending to know things that they don't. If we are sharing myths about our bias about cannabis, we're actually perpetuating this stigma. When patients and families have difficult conversations with healthcare providers, it takes courage and vulnerability. We're already coping with unsurmountable challenges. Feeling dismissed, judged, or discriminated against for doing what we believe is best causes emotional harm, and it can leave us plagued with feelings of self-doubt, rejection, and shame. When patients feel stigmatized, it discourages them from being honest with their care providers. They may even avoid discussions about medical cannabis, thereby not disclosing its use, or they may be using unregulated products to treat disease symptoms outside of their care team's knowledge. When this occurs, stigma is directly interfering with safe medical care and safe medical access. Reducing harms can be done through transparency. It can be as simple as being honest and disclosing your lack of knowledge on the subject, offering to consult further with a colleague, or offering to complete a referral to another practitioner who can provide a consult. It's important we recognize both the power imbalance in these relationships and the fear and anxiety which is often prevalent for patients and families. We're scared. We might not know how to ask you directly, but we'd like your help to be less afraid. When clinical conversations about the therapeutic use of cannabis occur, they ought to be collaborative and foster a sense of self-efficacy, self-determination, and personal control in the patient and family. When an absence of clinical guidance is provided, caregivers are left to follow their intuition and often wind up with peer-to-peer support in order to make the medical decisions involved with treating their child with cannabis. When we make healthcare decisions as the substitute decision maker for our children, the uncertainty is already overwhelming. At times, you're immobilized, stuck at the fork in the road between what you believe, what your understanding is of what your healthcare provider believes is best, and what your intuition is telling you to do. And no matter what you choose to do, until there's more scientific data, none of us truly knows. Many of us are willing to take on potential risk associated with providing our kids with cannabis, because the reality for us is, even if cannabis isn't in this equation, we're still in the position where we're faced with continued uncertainty regarding our children's health. The COVID-19 pandemic has globally shed light on how much we all desperately need more kindness in healthcare. Many of us have sadly forgotten that relationships between clinicians and patients are bidirectional, and healthcare values are deeply rooted in compassion. Our ability to see each other as people first, before simply referring or relating to each other as a diagnosis or a job title, recognizes our shared humanity, and is key to building trust in these unique relationships. Learning to actively listen to each other helps us understand each other's points of view and to focus on our common goals, because after all, we're on the same team. We'll need to work together to improve our system of care through being each other's allies. We need to take a step back from spending our time and energy being at odds with one another due to a difference of opinion about a plant. Trust us, we're worried about the risks to your patient too. We made them, and we live with them, and we're raising them, and we love them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tracy. That was really, really fantastic. And we thank you for all you do for C4T. We are honored to learn alongside all of our parent partners. We'll invite everyone actually to come back to the stage. And then we will go through the questions that have been submitted. So we can take down the slides and questions. Just a reminder for those who are listening, questions can be submitted in several ways. You can submit them online using Slido. The hashtag for that is C4T Webinars 2021. You can ask questions on Twitter, or you can also ask questions directly in the live YouTube link. So with that, I'm going to dive right in here. Our first question comes from our friends at MedCan Support in the UK. So maybe I'll ask this to Evan first, and then we can hear from some others. Given the complexities and costs around randomized clinical trials in full extract oils, will researchers have to rely on isolated compounds to build confidence in prescribing? Evan, did you have some thoughts on sort of isolated compounds versus maybe whole plant extracts?
Yeah, I lots of thoughts. I think
research in particular.
Yeah, that's particular. I think a lot comes back to Taylor's pyramid, which he showed. And Taylor, I had a great thought. Not great. I had a thought when you showed that pyramid, because that's like the classic pyramid we're all taught in medical school and taught in residency, science, et cetera, et cetera. And it also stems into kind of the whole area which I'm exploring, which is psychedelics, where you got to go back to the 60s and look. And the randomized control trial was really only a product out of the 60s. So prior to that, we didn't have such a thing as a randomized control trial. So it really is like a modern concept in science, which is fantastic, and it's proven to be great. But it really is based on a different time. I thought about this, Taylor, and I'd love to hear what you think about this, right? Like the shift, I think, with cannabis, coming back to Matt's question out of MedCan, is that I think we're going to need to rely on real world evidence, because it's going to be really difficult to establish proper randomized control trials for all the questions we want to ask about cannabis. Like cannabis, like I showed, is 450 different compounds. 450 trials would be insane, and never mind all the conditions, and you multiply that, it's going to be exponential. We'll never get the RCT data to be able to answer these things in our traditional model. So I do think that there will be a shift to real world evidence. We're going to have to do that. And then there's going to have to be some acceptance of real world evidence and how to roll that into current medicine. And Taylor, come back to what, your pyramid, it's a different age now. We can communicate 1,000 times more effectively. We have computer technology that can bank information, and AI, which can look at things differently. So, with enough real world evidence and enough of a database, can we mine out information from there that could really help to guide and inform practice, rather than to rely on singular RCTs for singular questions and singular conditions to then, go forward? Do we have to reframe that whole period and that pyramid and kind of put real world evidence type based stuff into that pyramid somewhere? I don't know the answer, but it has me thinking about it, because I just think it's going to be impossible. Like people, and meanwhile, while we try to work all this out from the RCT angle for cannabis and find single kind of cannabinoid products, kids are suffering, and they're clearly suffering, despite 3 very real examples here of people that can be helped by cannabis, never mind all of our combined experience.
Absolutely. And Taylor, did you have anything you wanted to add on there?
Yeah, no, it's such a fascinating debate, and that's why when I presented the pyramid, I gave a bit of a caveat saying, this is what we presented. This is the framework that we all come into this conversation with. But there's debate here, right? And I think you hit the nail on the head. I mean, cannabis is a unique product. There's such variety and variation between different strains. In an era where we have access to big data, or we could have access to big data and AI kind of mining into the information, there's going to be a lot of relationships that won't come out of kind of a traditional RCT. The challenge, though, is we've got data in my clinic and in your clinic and other clinics, and it's not talking. And so I think the challenge is that even though we are, facing a new reality in research where we, real world evidence, I think really can move that conversation forward, it's not happening right now, and it may not happen for a couple of years. And if I reflect on how epilepsy specifically really has kind of surged forward in this conversation, it was because of a proprietary extract that went through the RCT process. And so as much as I think that you're right, and I agree with you that this real world evidence is really going to push things forward for products like cannabis. You reflected on psychedelics as well, and I think there's a whole new frontier there that's probably going to benefit from real world evidence as well. But I think on practical, on the ground terms, when I chat with pediatric epileptologists and in my referral network, they became increasingly comfortable because of the RCTs that were put out. And so I think we are kind of in this funny straddle zone where we might be transitioning to kind of a new paradigm for that pyramid where we can start to kind of rejig things. But for the time being, the RCT continues, for better or for worse, to reign supreme. And so I think as soon as you're able to put together an RCT, it shifts the conversation immediately.
Yeah, I think I agree, certainly in terms of what people are used to seeing and looking at. But I do think there are, as you pointed out, some places where we're just, clinical trials aren't the right tool to answer that question. Like, for example, something like an inhaled exposure for sleep. Let me tell you, as the trialist on this panel, no ethics board is going to let me conduct a randomized clinical trial on smoked cannabis for sleep in adolescents. I will tell you that right now. And so in some cases, I think real world and observational evidence, if collected in a rigorous fashion, can potentially fill some of the gaps that trials just, are not going to be ethically able to do, things like studying drugs in pregnancy. How are we going to do that in a clinical trial? And so I think that's an interesting point. And maybe Alex, this feeds into sort of your talk. You talked about data and how data is important, and how I'm just wondering, and maybe some of the other parents I might ask you to chime in as well. How are you currently collecting data on, the cannabis products that you're using, on the doses that you're given? Do you have any suggestions for maybe how parents could do that in a rigorous way and how they can share that with their healthcare provider?
Do I go first?
Sure.
So there's a few tools in the market in terms of, real-time data collection, and some more that I'm actually involved in hoping to build soon. But I think what's important to note maybe on that topic is that we're in a better spot right now than we have been, I think, in quite some time, in the sense that if you're using a product, whether it's for yourself or your child, that is from a licensed producer and from the, legal framework, it's pretty evident what's in it. So it's relatively easy to share that with your physicians, and that's a super important thing to start with, in terms of allowing a doctor to understand what you're administering, what's in it. That's important data. And then in terms of dosing, that as well, obviously. So it used to be much more difficult because if, for example, when I was making oil for my daughter, I had every batch lab tested. So it was relatively simplistic for me to share that with the physicians as well. If you weren't getting a lab tested, which many people didn't do, because most people don't know how to do that, it obviously becomes much more difficult. So we're in a fortunate position in Canada anyways, where because of the legal framework that's in place, we can all be on a kind of open and honest page in terms of what's being used, and therefore we can extrapolate dosing and look for efficacy that way, which doctors can then use to treatment. So lots more data should be collected. There is some being collected, and we're in a fortunate position to, and many times at this point, know what's being administered, how much, and what the active ingredients are. So that can be discussed with the proper physician to.
And in terms of like tracking like progress, I know sometimes you have to switch products or switch doses. Do you have, I don't know, Mandy, maybe you have some thoughts on sort of how do you collect that data? Is it something that you still track?
I since Liam had his first seizure, I have documented every seizure, the duration, way back when, before he was diagnosed. We used to document environmental factors because we didn't know that he had Dravet syndrome at the time. So we thought, oh, maybe it's cell phone towers. Maybe, like, we were just trying to figure out what was going on. His diet, was he eating something? So up until he's 13 now, every year I have a black binder that has everything in it, because if I don't document it, I don't remember. If he has a seizure yesterday and I don't write down when it was or what he was doing, today I won't remember when it was. So it's the only way for me. And then sometimes, and I also document all of his medications and his cannabis oil, what the doses were, if he was sick, if he had a trigger. And sometimes I'll populate a spreadsheet to see if I can see trends. I think as a parent, you never stop looking for answers. You always are trying to do better. You always want to do better for your child. So, Gwen hasn't had a seizure in 5 years, and I'm sure he's still trying to perfect. I'm sure he's still trying different strains and still, because it never stops, because you always maybe there's something better where cognitively they'll do better.
I still wake up in the middle of the night and go check on her because I think, what if she's having a seizure, even though it's been
right? You never stop. So yeah, I think that I've had different LPs contact me about my research, right? Like asking me different questions because they know from previous talks that I meticulously keep track of everything, because, how do we know? We just, that's what we do.
Yeah, that's really amazing. And you've been collecting. Do you have like a room full of notebooks? Like, what is the physical?
I know.
Collect all these fantastic notes in.
It's crazy.
Tracy, I was wondering, and both Alex and Mandy have been advocating in this space a long time. And your experience is a little bit newer in terms of just, in terms of where the cannabis space was in Canada. I wondered if you had maybe any advice for parents that were considering using medical cannabis with their children. We really hope for a future where all families are comfortable to ask questions. And Alex, I love the framing of, you have to ask, can this work? Not present, does this work? And so Tracy, I wondered if you wanted to speak to maybe some of advice for parents when thinking about communicating with their healthcare providers.
When I was thinking in terms of advice, I feel like a lot in terms of advice and advocacy, kind of runs along the line with being a special needs parent in general. So I just think it's really important to find other families that are sharing similar challenges and find out what's worked for them and what hasn't, and just build your allies, whether those people are within your network of people or whether they're also people within the healthcare network. I think is really important as well. And that way you can find people to kind of group together and advocate together. And also just having a strong support network is so important to start intentionally kind of curating that village right from the get-go whenever anybody's faced with a lot of challenges or adversity. So I don't really think that necessarily things need to apply directly to the arena of cannabis. I just think it's really hard when somebody that you love is sick and you need to take care of yourself. And if you don't, you're going to wind up emotionally and spiritually bankrupt. self-care is way beyond bubble baths and going to get your nails done and having somebody watch your kid for a little while. Like, you really have to pay close attention to your own emotional capacity and find ways to release stress and maintain your identity outside of your role as a caregiver. And like listening to like Alex and Mandy and talking about their documentation, like my anxiety was like through the roof. Like I just couldn't do that. Like I cannot be a nurse 24 hours a day. Like my role, my identity can't only be nurse and nurse parent. Like I did do a lot of documentation in the beginning, but when I felt like it was sort of falling on deaf ears and I was documenting for who, nobody cared. So I was like, this is making me insane. I need to stop. Like I need to just treat my kid like he's a kid. And I set alarms for his medications. And I do sometimes have like on a more stressful, busy day, like a tick sheet to make sure, but that's just for me to make sure like Mandy's saying, you don't remember when you're in chaos and you're under stress, like you don't remember things. So did I give him that noon medication today? I don't remember. So it's just like having a little scrap piece of paper that I just tick, 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 Kate, things are done. And we just kind of move on and try as much as possible to live a normal life. And I think like in terms of like communicating with healthcare providers, there's lots of barriers, and there are similar barriers that are in communication with anybody in any relationship. So lack of trust in healthcare, lots of times that lack of trust comes from a place of systemic trauma, adverse childhood events. And that's where as a care provider, being trauma informed and trauma aware is key. And I know like in psychiatry, in psychology, like there's a lot of training that goes into what does that mean. But in terms of like other med school sort of information, like there's just so much to jam pack in. I think it's really important as a care provider that you teach yourself that you find that education and training and you understand what it means, because there is we think that we understand what the patient experience is, and then you become the patient and like you don't have a clue, right? And we're all going to find out at some point in time, because we're all going to become sick. We're all going to have a family member that becomes sick, and it's just really eye-opening to see what it's like on the other side, especially when you have to show up at work the next day, and it's just sort of like trying to find that balance has been really difficult. And then for me, like I mentioned it briefly in my presentation, but just trying not to take system related issues personally. Like really the healthcare providers are so confined by so many limitations within their practice and within the institutions that they work at. It's really hard to show up at an appointment with your child and not sort of understand what the rationale is behind those limitations, or that even that limitation exists. Like you take a lot of things to heart and a lot of things personally, and it's really not. So if you can find a way as a healthcare provider to explain rationales to people, like we're all at heart still children that want to know why. So if you cannot do something, why? If I don't ask you why, I'm thinking it. You need to tell people why. And a lot of assumptions, right? The healthcare provider makes an assumption about what the family wants. The family makes an assumption about potential judgment that the healthcare provider is having. And we're all really busy and we get impatient, we're hungry, emotions feel heightened, and we all want to speak to our own personal agenda. And when we do that, we're not listening to the other person.
Yeah, that's very, very true, especially around listening in a harm reduction approach. I think with cannabis, if you tell a family no, I mean, they can still access cannabis. It's not something like a prescription that is sort of held behind a din and requires prescription for access. I mean, any parent can walk around the corner and I could probably walk to 7 different dispensaries and pick up some cannabis oil. And so I think that's where that harm reduction is really important to talk about it with healthcare providers. There is another question that just came in, and maybe I can just answer quickly before asking the next one. Is if Epidiolex is why is Epidiolex not introduced on the Canadian market? The answer to that is quick and easy. It is that they have not applied for access to the Canadian market. They have not submitted their data to Health Canada. And to market Epidiolex here. I believe there are some families importing it under compassionate access but it is not available as of yet. Another question that came in with registration is around side effects with other pharmaceuticals. And Evan, I think both you and Taylor pointed to the fact that, CBD is not a nerve, it doesn't not do anything. So you talked a little bit about, you had some really great tables for drug-drug interactions, Evan. Wondering if there's any tools available, like is there any online tools or anything that families could use to look for drug-drug interactions? Is there any maybe lay tools?
I don't know, to be honest. I don't use, I'm not sure if anybody else does. None that I would reliably use.
So sounds like we have some homework then.
But maybe, I don't know if other people have come across some, but I would not rely on the vast majority that are out there. Like there's like Drug MD checker or something. I don't know. Like I've never used those, and I would probably caution away because from those.
I would unfortunately agree. Like in terms of clinical practice with use of cannabinoids, I think as Evan presented in his slides presented, we're continuing to learn about this. Theoretically, there are tremendous potential interactions because this is being processed by the cytochrome P450 system and subenzymes. This is a common metabolic pathway for a lot of different medications. But the reality is fortunately, most medications are not causing significant interactions, but we're still learning about them, right? And so we know some of them, particularly from the epilepsy trials. We're aware of clobazam, valproic acid in terms of liver enzymes. We're aware of some of the anticoagulants in terms of blood thinning, but we're still learning about it. So there's no single resource that I would rely on. It's very much keeping up to date with the literature and looking at it on a kind of case-by-case basis with the patients and kind of monitoring them closely.
Yeah. And Evan, I noticed you had some lab monitoring for drug-drug interactions. I don't know if you wanted to speak to that, or if there's anything that parents can do to monitor for adverse reactions outside of the clinic.
Yeah, sure. I was just going to follow up from what Taylor's saying, which is really important. So, given that Taylor just described how absent the actual data is there, and that we're still evolving this, and it's kind of what I alluded to. As a practitioner, what I do is I just standardize my pre-requirements across the board for everybody, pretty much. So there's standard blood work I'll check. There's I even do an ECG on every single patient, and I'll say why in a second. And then I'll customize that a little bit depending on kind of known drug interactions like clobazam or topiramate or valproic acid. And now I'm going to add levothyroxine into there as potentially. So I'll look for certain labs based on those variables as well. ECG, for instance, we know cannabis acts on the heart, the muscles of the heart. And so for me, when any patient comes through, given all the controversy around cannabis as there is, and there's always a lag period, I would never want anybody with an undiagnosed heart condition to suffer a side effect from cannabis. You can easily give ECG and just do a screen and pick something up. So I over investigate, I would say, individually when it comes to assessment, and I do that because again, just to be overly cautious right now because it's a bit of the Wild West and we don't really know what's doing what. So I standardize that across the board, and then through that have informed my own practice. So for instance, I test TSH on everybody. I've seen thyroid go up in the context of valproic acid in some cases, right? Now, again, that's very anecdotal. It's just me. So, that's not the best medicine because I could have a biased lens, but I'd rather be safe than sorry in those cases. So, yeah. And then for parents, from a parent's point of view, I wouldn't standardize that information right now. I would just say, when starting cannabis, have a good discussion with your doctor as to specifically what should be looked for. Because given that I just said there's a variety of different things and there's individualized things you might check, you're going to have individualized side effects and individualized outcomes that you'll want to monitor for. And that's very easy. Like a physician should know that stuff. It's not, and a nurse and a nurse practitioner and a physician assistant should all know that stuff. It's not difficult to kind of counsel families accordingly in that case. You're muted, Lauren.
Tracy, sorry, did you have a comment you wanted to add about drug-drug interactions?
I think Evan pretty much covered it. Like, that's a lot of what I did at first when there was some expressed concern, but no details given. My son was, as an oncology patient, having frequent blood work, which when on chemotherapy also included a lot of stuff around around liver and processing of the chemotherapy and what was sort of happening with that. And I just took a look at all the medications he was on and pretended I was a pharmacist and went through the pharmacology and pharmacokinetics of every medication, what toxicity looked like for every single one of those medications, how many milligrams per kilogram, and based on the dosing that he was having of those things. And as chemotherapies would change and stuff, like what were the potential toxicity effects of those medications. And just if I wasn't seeing any changes on the blood work or any of those things, then I just sort of assumed that everything was okay. And I also felt really comfortable with the dosing of he was on such a low dose. We weren't trying to do any kind of anti-tumor treating of the tumors with cannabis. So we were on very low doses, trying to support just like having him not throw up, having him be able to like go outside and play, just maintaining quality of life.
Yeah, for sure. There's so many challenges and so many different experiences. And I think that's one thing that a lot of you brought up is that there's really no one size fits all. Someone said it, I forget which one of you, there's really no one size fits all model for this. And there's so many different types of cannabis products, and there's so many different complexities in terms of some of the pediatric indications that are using cannabis products. And so, when we think about, some of the challenges that we're facing today regarding cannabis products for health-related purposes in children, I just have one last question, and I think I'm going to ask each one of you to respond if that's all right. So perhaps maybe you first. What would you say is one actionable step that could move the space of cannabis research with children and young adults forward?
I think the number one thing is doctor education. I think that, when we go to CHIO, Liam's neurologist their policy is they don't prescribe cannabis, but they will refer to, a cannabis clinic. But when we go in to talk to him, he is 100% listening to us. He's taking notes. He has lots of kids using cannabis, and he wants to learn because he wants to help his patients. And he is trying to educate himself through his patients and all of the anecdotal evidence of what he's hearing. But I have a friend who works for an LP, and her only job is to go into clinics and educate doctors about cannabis and prescribing cannabis and going through the forms to explain how cannabis would be prescribed and how it works and how the program works. That's her job. And she does that all day long. And I think that it's really important because I think it's definitely lagging. And it's probably one of the things, the more doctors that are educated and helping patients, then I think it will definitely help move us forward.
Lauren, you're on muting.
All of us on the panel today would agree with you. I had to mute because my dog is eating garbage in the kitchen right now. Real life, right? And so I think we would all agree with you that absolutely some healthcare professional education is certainly something that we could improve on moving forward. Alex, what do you think? What's one step that could move this space forward?
Well, I agree with Mandy's comments. And quite frankly, I think a very important step is happening at this very moment. This conversation in itself, the fact that C4T has 100+ members that are interested in moving forward with research and listening to people like Mandy, Tracy, myself, and many others who have actual real world experience and are taking that into account in developing the research protocols is an amazing thing. That is just a number one excellent step. And other than that, I think there's an access barrier, both financially and physical, and that's a much larger discussion that we'll have to have as time goes on.
We could probably host a whole webinar on some of the financial barriers to access for families. Certainly not an easy solution, but definitely a place where we need some more advocacy and even research, because I think if we can show not only that there are some benefits and the safety profile, the next thing that we need to be looking at is that there's a cost benefit profile as well. And I think as researchers, it always reminds me that this is a really important thing for families. Probably, almost the most important after obviously seeing benefits and safety. And so I think from the research community, it's really important that we hear how valuable us collecting that information and advocating and being able to make graphs that show these things and sort of making academic deliverables that can really hopefully support some discussions around some financial cost recovery mechanisms. Tracy, what are your thoughts? What is one actionable step to move the cannabis space forward?
I think we really need to focus a lot on stigma and debunking the myths which are being perpetuated in society and in the medical community. And I think an actionable way we can work towards this is creating online space outside of traditional social media space where patients and families can share their individual stories, photos, real life situations. And sometimes that helps people to shift their perspectives over time, hearing the real life stories. It could be a project that also includes adult, youth, and children, because I think there's stigma around just cannabis as medicine in general. And I think also too that storytelling is nurturing and healing, and moving forward in this space, I think it's going to be rooted in collective storytelling, whether it's clinicians telling each other how their mind has shifted based on patient story or patients sharing their own story. And I think that we need to do it together, and the people that can help move that space forward are the ones currently benefiting from it. And like stigma is so profound that even me being in this space and having been a member of C4T and having been exploring cannabis for my child since 2017, when I found out that we were going live on YouTube and it was being recorded and going to be on the internet for 100 million years, I had stigma against myself. Like, how am I going to go on the internet and be a substance use nurse who gives her kid cannabis? Like, I stigmatized myself about it. So it's so profound. We, like, even those of us that are very comfortable in this space, like, we still have some preconceived biases around it.
And hopefully that's something that the research can help to change. And I think your point about storytelling it really hits home, because I know I have learned, I get endless amounts of information from all of your stories. And it really helps drive the work that we do at C4T, is seeing and meeting and hearing from some of the families that are in this space. And so thank you, all three of you, not only for today, but for all you do for us.
It could be an art project.
All right, Evan, what are your thoughts?
So, kind of tying all the things that, like, some of the topics that we've talked about today, from my current present perspective and what I've seen evolve over the many years being around this space, is you got a lot of moving parts all kind of happening. We all want them to connect on the dot and that connect to the patient, and having a model for cannabis that works. That's not happening now. Okay, that's going to be the future for sure. Hopefully, hopefully it's not now. So, like, what needs to happen now is we have to, as doctors, when I say we, I'm thinking doctors, medical professionals, we need to change our perspective. Tracy brought it up at first. This was a massive paradigm shift for me that broke me out of my traditional mold in which I was taught in westernized medicine here in Canada, was the concept of harm reduction. It's so poorly taught in medical school. It's not in that residency, in training, especially in a field like neurology, which is very dichotomous, very black and white, right? There almost is no such thing as harm reduction in neurology per se. So that lens, when I was given that lens, it allowed me to understand so much more in medicine, and it's allowed me to really understand cannabis. The point is this, and I think, Lauren, you mentioned it before, that a doctor can say no to somebody, and then you said that patient can go and get cannabis. I would change that language to say that patient will go get cannabis. So the fact that they will, you have to come to terms with that as a practitioner. Now wear that as an assumption, and now do what you need to do, and what the Hippocratic Oath that you took, fulfill that. And the fulfillment of the Hippocratic Oath is first do no harm. So when a physician refuses to be educated, refuses to be participating in this, falls prey to the stigma, or doesn't even have the lens to accept that there might even be stigma attached to his or her opinions, you are doing more harm when you're allowing that patient, knowing full well that they're going to go out and go get that themselves and give it to their kid, for instance, or take it themselves. Like, to me, that latter situation is much more harmful. You're actually doing a disservice to the patient. It might not be in the short term, but certainly in the long term. So I think, bringing all this together, doctor education, Taylor, you brought up recognizing trends. We got to see these trends where certainly they're headed. I mean, we know where cannabis is going. It's not going away, that's for sure. Tracy, you talked about kind of truly understanding the full patient experience. That's part of like the doctor, the physician, the nurse practitioner having that lens. And this shift in research has to move away from this dichotomous black and white. It's got to move into harm reduction. And that's where real world evidence really fits into that model. So it's about that. And that ultimately is, clouded in stigma. So harm reduction model, I think, kind of ensnares all of the moving parts right now and provides a path for a physician that's kind of uncertain, doesn't know, or nurse practitioner, physician assistant, or any kind of person to move forward. So I think that's it. We need a paradigm shift, looking at these things. Cannabis, psychedelics are here, they're down the road. It's going to require the same lens in order to help and provide the greater good.
Thank you
Nurse
so much.
educators. We need nurse educators.
Yes, for sure. Taylor, did you have any final thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, lots of excellent points, and I love this kind of panel opportunity because you're able to get that different perspective from each different lens, and I agree with all of my colleagues on today in terms of those being incredibly important. I think for me, when I step back, because I agree with everything that's been said, in many respects, I think for me, what brings things together, it's already happening, and it actually, as a bit of a call out to C4T, is I think it's that coordination that Evan kind of alluded to. If we look across the country, there aren't a lot of authorizers supporting pediatric families. And we know that's a problem. But they're actually doing it right now, and they're collecting data, and they have patient data, and it's just locked in these little silos. And so if we're able to have the coordinator that's bringing together the families, bringing together the prescribers, or the authorizers, the researchers, I think we're going to be able to make that big push. And so I think there's lots of things that'll help move things forward. But I think one thing that's practical and actionable that will move things forward, I think already is. Like, if you think of C4T, only was founded in 2018. A lot of the papers that I cited in my preschool presentation had C4T members on it. It's not a coincidence. We're bringing together a community of people who are involved in this space because of family patient experience and advocacy. They're actually authorizing, they're on the ground in the clinics doing this, they're educating, they're doing the research, they're doing the policy work. And I think that coordinating effort is actually so critically important. It's almost the invisible kind of vaccines that brings it all together. And so I think that, for me, is really the key to drive the conversation forward and to drive research forward. And I think, fingers crossed, it's already starting to happen. It's just a matter of bringing the right people to the table and continuing to bring them to the table, and then allowing them to coordinate and come together. Like, I see, if you have like a pediatric patient registry for epilepsy patients, if we bring all that data and put it into the giant pot and then allow for analysis, I think something like that's great, but it requires the coordination to make it happen.
For sure. And all of that data is so powerful, and it's a shame that it's being hidden away in these silos. And certainly something at C4T that you will all know is our open door policy. You know, we really do strive to bring everyone to the same table, and we're really grateful for all of the passionate people out there. And that's one thing we have going for us in pediatrics in Canada is it's a small, you know, there's not that many pediatricians who are authorizing cannabis, and so it's almost easy to identify who those experts are. I think the big challenge for us is going to be to roll out education for all, so that it's not just based on these, you know, single centers or little, you know, individual experts, if you will, but more of a broad understanding of some of the potential benefits and challenges. So thank you very much for all of our panelists today for sharing your extensive expertise. Just a reminder that our session was recorded today. It will be on YouTube and shared broadly. So please check out, we'll also post it on our website, c4trials.org. And please join us again on Wednesday. We'll be meeting with our youth research partners and some other researchers. We'll be talking about how you think we should be designing cannabis studies. We're really going to be taking all that we talked about today and really focusing on moving that space forward, talking about cannabis in schools and also around some of the research challenges and a little bit of an update on all of the work that we're doing at C4T. So thank you everyone for joining us today, and we hope to see you again on Wednesday.